Morning, everybody. Welcome back to Corey Hughes' Bloody History. And so I spent, Jesus Christ, so much of the weekend, even through two broadcasts, studying this damn Oswald stuff. And let me tell you, I'm trying really hard. I'm trying really hard to play devil's advocate with my own research. And I'm trying really hard to debunk the idea that there were two Oswalds. And I'm having a hard time doing it. The couple points that I'm stuck on all have to do with his time in the Marines, which is what we're basically covering here. We're up to October 57, which is where things start to get interesting. Well, they've been interesting the whole time, but they get really kind of, you don't know what to believe starting in around October of 57. So, one of the problems I have is the documentary and photographic record clearly puts Lee Harvey Oswald at Biloxi, Mississippi, where he's one of 6 Marines training radar and radio with the rest of an Air Force Academy group. So there's only 6 Marines in that group, and we have a photograph of them, and that included Schrand, the guy who got killed in, where was that, the Philippines? So when you read the testimony later of, who was it? It wasn't Powers. It was one of the other guys, one of the other leaders of the group that Oswald was in, of that 6. By the time they get to the Philippines, they're down to like 3 or 4 of them. One of the problems I have is that we have this testimony from a guy named Feld, who claims that he went through boot camp with Lee Harvey Oswald and that they showed up in Jacksonville to go to the basic aviation school in May and June, right? But during May and June is when the school at Biloxi was happening. But here's another problem I have. You have to go to the basic school before you go to the advanced school. So the idea that anybody could go to radar school before going to Jacksonville, to me, is ridiculous. So what we have is, we have the written statement of this guy named Feld, who was a Marine who was in there with Oswald, and he says that they went from Camp Pendleton in San Diego to Jacksonville in May and June, and then in July they went to Memphis. So the problem is, Armstrong went and pulled all the records of people who should have been there with Oswald, and he found a Feld, but it's not an Allen Feld. He found an Alexander Feld, F-E-L-D-E, in the same class with Lee Harvey Oswald at Camp Pendleton. So we have some shenanigans surrounding Mr. Feld, who said that his name was Allen, A-L-L-E-N Feld. But there was no Allen Feld in with Oswald. There was an Alexander Feld. And when you look for an Alexander Feld, you can't find anything. And remember, Feld stated that after he parted ways with Lee Harvey Oswald in September of 1957, that he went down to Opelika, which at the time was a CIA base. So there's some questions surrounding Mr. Feld. We don't know anything about Mr. Feld now. That obviously his name was not given to us accurately. The only supporting information we have that Oswald actually was at Jacksonville in May and June is that in this handwritten autobiography that was kind of found amongst Oswald's possessions, he said that he was at Jacksonville in May and June. The problem is, though, he outlines, and we have it here. Let me see if I can find it. We have Oswald's where he was supposed to be as per his autobiography. But in his autobiography, he lays out all the dates of his entire enlistment, and he never mentions Biloxi. But then in the next paragraph, he says in his time at Biloxi. And then we have a guy named Owen Dejanovic, I believe that's how you say it, who claims that he was at fucking at the radar school in Biloxi with Lee Harvey Oswald, but he's not one of the 6 people who's documented in the photo as graduating, or he's not on the list, and his name is not mentioned by anybody else. So there's a ton of conflicting information around Oswald and his activities in the Marines. I mean, that's just a reality. And the section we're going to go over here today on 1957, hopefully it'll clear up some things, but I don't think it will. And this is going to involve Mr. Palmer McBride, who I don't see why his testimony isn't credible. But we'll get to that. So let me begin here. October 57, Harvey Oswald and the short, heavyset Marguerite Oswald are in New Orleans. So remember, Lee Harvey Oswald's supposed to be in the Marines at this time. But he's not. Or so it seems. But we have documentation of October 57. What happened in October of 57? Lee Harvey Oswald shoots himself with his Derringer 22 and ends up in the hospital until November 15th at Atsugi, right? So that's a problem. That is a big problem. Because if Oswald is in New Orleans, then how can he be in Atsugi? It's in a military hospital recovering from a gunshot wound. A gunshot wound, I might mention, that did not appear on the autopsy of Lee Harvey Oswald at all above his left elbow. All right, let me continue on here. After attending the Naval Technical Training Center in Tennessee, remember, we don't have any confirmation that he was ever in Memphis. Harvey Oswald left the Marines and soon moved in with the Marguerite Oswald imposter at the upscale Hotel Senator in New Orleans. Paul Fiorello began working at Pfister Dental Laboratory as a delivery boy in the spring of 1956, a job he held until 1966. Paul told me about a year to a year and a half after I started working at Pfister's, which would be the summer or fall of 57, Lee Harvey Oswald was hired. 18-year-old Palmer McBride was working in the dental lab as a messenger. He remembered when Harvey Oswald was hired, and the 2 teenagers soon became close friends. He and Oswald were together on October 4th, 1957, when the USSR launched Sputnik, the first satellite into orbit. A month later, on November 3rd, 1957, the USSR launched a second rocket and carried a dog named Laika into space. Oswald told McBride the Russians' successful space launches were proof of the superiority of the communist system. McBride responded by saying that he felt the U.S. should place more emphasis on our space program. McBride had said that he and Oswald discussed recent space successes and the possibility of war. The 2 young men were constantly discussing Russia and communism. Pfister office worker Imelda Smith told the FBI that she remembered that Oswald and McBride often discussed and argued about the merits of communism. McBride liked to visit the Opera House in New Orleans, where his father worked part-time. On one occasion, McBride and Oswald attended the opera. Boris Godunov. During the 1950s, Boris Godunov played only twice in New Orleans, on October 10th and October 12th of 1957. And Armstrong has the flyer here. He has a copy of the flyer here. And he also has a picture here showing that the Hotel Senator is directly across the street from the Pfister Dental Lab. In the French Quarter, the streets are very narrow. The Hotel Senator was directly across the street from Pfister's, less than 50 feet from the dental lab. McBride said that Oswald lived with his mother on the 2nd floor of the hotel, and every day Oswald would go home for lunch. On one occasion, Oswald took McBride to his apartment and showed him Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, books which McBride had no interest. Oswald introduced McBride to his mother, who soon left and told the boys she was going to the grocery store. McBride described Oswald's mother as short, heavy-set, gray-haired, and not very friendly. McBride said that he invited Oswald to his home to listen to classical music on 2 or 3 occasions. November and December 1957. In November and December of 1957, while Lee Oswald was aboard the USS Terrell County on maneuvers in the Philippines and the South China Sea, Harvey Oswald and the short, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald imposter were living at the Hotel Senator in the French Quarter. Harvey was working across the street at Pfister Dental Lab with Palmer McBride. In November and December 1957, Lee Oswald's tall, nice-looking mother was living in apartment number 3 at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth and working at Paul's department store. During the Christmas holidays, a group photo was taken of store employees. In the middle of this group, is Lee Oswald's mother, a tall, nice-looking Marguerite Oswald, who always worked in clothing and shoe stores. When this photo is compared with a photo of the short, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald imposter, anyone can see that their appearance, height, and weight are different photos. These photos of two different women, both using the name Marguerite Oswald, are one of the most important smoking guns in understanding the teenage years of Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald. In 1996, I showed McBride two photographs of Marguerite Oswald, the short, dumpy, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald, and sitting in the living room of apartment 126 Exchange Place, and the tall, nice-looking, well-dressed Marguerite Oswald in Paul's shoe store, Christmas 1957. McBride had no trouble identifying the photograph of the short, dumpy, heavy-set woman sitting in the chair as the woman Harvey Oswald introduced him to as his mother in 1957. But when I asked Palmer if he recognized the woman in the second photograph, the tall, nice-looking, well-dressed Marguerite Oswald, Palmer said he did not recognize her. And here, Armstrong has two photographs. One of Marguerite in 1954 in 126 Exchange Place. It's very rare we have a photographic record pinning a particular Marguerite at a particular address. And then we have here Marguerite Oswald in Paul's shoe store, Christmas 1957. Following and understanding the Marguerite Oswald imposter, one of the most noticeable features that distinguishes these two women is their eyebrows. The eyebrows of the Marguerite Oswald imposter on the left are angled sharply downward at an angle of 45 degrees. The eyebrows of Marguerite Claverie Oswald are nearly horizontal. In July of 57, the short, heavy-set imposter moved from 4936 Collinwood to 1031 West 5th in Fort Worth. 2 months later, in September 57, she moved to New Orleans and resided with Harvey in a small apartment on the second floor of Hotel Senator. 1957-1958, the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association. By early 1958, Palmer McBride had been attending bi-monthly meetings of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association for 3 years. Most recently at the home of Walter Gerke, who lived at 208 Hector Avenue in nearby Metairie, Louisiana. McBride told the FBI, in early 58, I took Oswald with me to a meeting of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association at the home of Walter Gerke. When interviewed by the FBI, Gerke confirmed McBride's memory of his meeting Oswald in 58. Gerke told the FBI, none of the meetings of the NOAAA were held at my house until about 58. Gerke's statement meant that McBride and Harvey Oswald could not have attended the NOAAA meetings at his house anytime prior to 1958. Ralph Hartwell, Palmer McBride, William Wolfe, and Walter Gerke's statements leave no doubt Harvey attended a meeting of the NOAAA at Gerke's home in early 1958. In January 58, James Harrison Vance was Palmer McBride's best friend and a member of the New Orleans Astronomy Club. On one occasion, McBride asked Vance if he would work in his place at Pfister Dental Lab, which Vance agreed to do. When the two young men arrived at the lab, McBride introduced Vance to Harvey Oswald. A few days later, on January 31st, 1958, the New Orleans Astronomy Club held a special meeting at Vance's house when the first U.S. satellite was placed in orbit aboard Explorer 1, launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida, 9:38 p.m. Ralph Hartwell was vice president of the NOAAA in 1955, when meetings were held at the Cunningham Observatory, and in 1956, when meetings were held at the DeSalle High School. On December 18, 1956, Hartwell joined the Air Force and left New Orleans, but corresponded with members of the Astronomy Club via voice tape recordings. Hartwell told the FBI that while he was in the Air Force, he heard that Oswald either became a member or had attended meetings of the NOAAA. Hartwell remembered that Palmer McBride and William Wolfe had dealings with Oswald. Note, in early 1958, while Harvey Oswald was working at the dental lab, palling around with McBride and getting acquainted with members of the Astronomy Association, Lee Oswald was in the South China Sea on January 22, 1958. Lee Oswald left Subic Bay in the Philippines aboard a landing ship tank en route to Corregidor, a distance of 40 miles. In Corregidor, Zach Stout, George Wilkins, Bobby Warren, and Lee Oswald spent countless off-duty hours exploring caves and tunnels and old battle sites from World War II. Oswald took numerous color photographs of Stout, Wilkins, Warren, and fellow Marines that are now located at the National Archives. I showed Mr. Stout these photos, and he identified most of his fellow Marines. In late 58, McBride took Harvey Oswald. In late winter or spring of 58, McBride took Harvey Oswald with him to William Wolfe's house. Wolfe remembered he, McBride, brought Oswald over to my house one evening about 10:30 or so. We got into a very long conversation that lasted maybe until 3 a.m., about 2:30 or 3 in the morning. A couple weeks later, McBride and Oswald returned to Wolfe's house for a second visit. Wolfe recalled, "The second time I met Harvey Oswald was under the same circumstances. This boy, McBride, brought him, Oswald, over, and we had another long conversation. And this time I was interested in history, etc. And he brought up, I don't know how we got around to it, communism, and he started bringing up his association. He believed in Marxism and Lenin theory, and that he would advocate this. He even mentioned that he tried to join a cell of the Communist Party in New Orleans, and he couldn't find anything, apparently. We got into a discussion on communism, and he was very vehement about it. My father, who was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, we ended up waking him up, and he came back and heard the conversation. My father finally had enough communism when he was in World War I and on the German side, and when he got out of the social communist revolt was going on in Germany. He was not the man to accept someone else's views, especially when this boy at his age was very antagonistic to anyone who didn't believe his way. So my father literally threw him out. This was Oswald's second and last visit to Wolfe's house, and the only occasion during which Wolfe's father saw Harvey Oswald. In the spring of 1958, Palmer McBride and Harvey Oswald continued to deliver the finished products of Pfister Dental Lab to the local dentists, and continued to discuss astronomy and argue about communism. McBride recalled that he and Oswald also spent a lot of time talking about a new novel by Boris Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago. This novel was first published in the U.S. in 1958 and earned Pasternak the Nobel Prize for Literature. Important, McBride and Oswald could not have discussed Dr. Zhivago in 1956, the year during which the Warren Commission said Oswald worked at Pfister's, because Dr. Zhivago was not published in the U.S. until 1958. McBride and Oswald continued their friendship through spring of 58 and occasionally double-dated. On one occasion, Oswald and their dates attended a movie. Oswald began to talk about communism. The young girl with Oswald became so annoyed that she ended the date early and left. After this incident, McBride and Oswald's friendship began to cool, and they saw less and less of each other after work. In May 58, Harvey Oswald told McBride he was moving to Fort Worth with his mother, where he had a job selling shoes. When I asked McBride to pinpoint the date of Oswald's departure, he said, "I joined the Air Force Reserves on August 15, 1958, and Oswald quit approximately 2 months later." It appears Harvey Oswald and his caretaker mother left New Orleans sometime in June of 58. Wait a minute. 2 months earlier. Okay, so he left in June of 58 and returned to Fort Worth, Texas. On July 29, 1958, the short, heavyset Marguerite Oswald imposter opened a bank account at the First National Bank of Fort Worth and gave her address as 3006 Bristol Road. Harvey Oswald, who was living with a caretaker mother, wrote a letter to the dental lab and said he found a job in Fort Worth selling shoes. The letter was read aloud to McBride and to the delivery boys by the office manager, Earl Williamson. So just a point of note here, the address 3006 Bristol Road, as I was going through the documents of John Eli Hart, who Armstrong mentions at some point, he says the address at one point was corrected from 3006 Bristol Road to 2006 Bristol Road, just to make a point of that in case you're interested. Harvey Oswald, who was living with his caretaker mother, wrote a letter to, I read that part. Palmer McBride, November 22nd, 63. On November 22nd, 1963, Palmer McBride was in the U.S. Air Force and stationed at Patrick Air Force Base in Cape Canaveral. After learning that Lee Harvey Oswald had been arrested in Dallas and was charged with murdering the president, McBride contacted officers from the Special Investigations Unit. McBride told officers at the OSI that he had worked with Oswald at Pfister Dental Lab in New Orleans in 1957 and 1958. The OSI contacted the FBI and then sent the following memo to headquarters, Dallas, New Orleans, the next day. FBI agents arrived at the dental lab and began interviewing owners and employees of the company. Let me read this memo. To Director Dallas, New Orleans, Tampa, from SAC Atlanta. Why they're sending it to Tampa, I don't know. Assassination of the President, November 22, 63, Dallas. Re-Bureau Tell to all Sacks, November 23, instant. Major Crawford Hicks, 6th District OSI, USA, Robbins Air Force Base, Macon, Georgia, advised November 23, instant that Airman 2C, Palmer McBride, as of 2558-9222-6550, Maintenance Group, Patrick Air Force Base, Cape Canaveral, Florida, is acquainted with Lee Harvey Oswald and that he and Oswald were employed as delivery boys for the Pfister Dental Lab, Dauphine Street, New Orleans, from 1957 to 1958. Oswald at this time, according to McBride, was preaching the communist doctrine and stated he would like to kill President Eisenhower in view of Eisenhower's, quote, exploitation of the working people, unquote. Oswald did not mention plan or fact he had a gun. New Orleans will verify employment of Oswald and will interview other employees. Restatements of Oswald and end ACK. The OSI officer who interviewed McBride wrote in his own handwriting what McBride said about his knowledge and friendship with Lee Harvey Oswald while working with him at the Pfister Dental Lab in 1957 and 1958. The FBI obtained the OSI officer's handwritten interview of McBride and prepared a 4-page written transcript, which was given to the Warren Commission, identified as CE 1386, published in 26 volumes. Airman Second Class Palmer McBride was interviewed at Air Police Headquarters, Patrick Air Force Base, Florida, furnished the following information. I, Palmer McBride, hereby furnish the following free and voluntary statement to John R. Palmer, who I know to be special agent of the FBI. I've been advised that this statement can be used in the court of law, blah, blah, blah. I was born November 29th, 1937 at New Orleans. I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force November 25th, 1960. And since June 15th, 1961, I've been assigned to Patrick Air Force Base, Florida. I'm presently an Airman Second Class assigned to the 6550 Maintenance Group with Air Force serial number, and he gives his number. In about June 1955, I went to work as a dental messenger for the Pfister Dental Laboratory in 200 block of Dauphine Street in New Orleans. In about December 57, a young man named Lee Oswald was employed in the same capacity. Because we both enjoyed classical music, I invited him to my home at 1416 Baronne Street, New Orleans, and he did visit my home perhaps 2 or 3 times. I was living with my parents at the time, and during his visits, we would listen to records in my room. During his first visit to my home in late 1957 or early 1958, the discussion turned to politics and the possibility of war. At this time, I made a statement to the effect that President Dwight Eisenhower was doing a pretty good job for a man of his age and background, but that I did feel more emphasis should be placed on the space program in view of the Russian success. Oswald was very anti-Eisenhower and stated that President Eisenhower was exploiting the working people. Then he made a statement to the effect he'd like to kill President Eisenhower because he was exploiting the working class. This statement was not made in jest, and Oswald was serious frame of mind when he made the statement. Lee Oswald was very serious about the virtues of communism and discussed these virtues at every opportunity. He would say that the capitalists were exploiting the working class, and his central theme seemed to be that the workers in the world would one day rise up and throw them out of their chains. He praised Khrushchev's sincerity in improving the lot of the worker. In early 58, I took Oswald with me to a meeting of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association at the home of Walter Gehrke on Hector Avenue, Metairie, Louisiana. This meeting was presided over by the association president, William Eugene Wolfe Jr., 2107 Annunciation Street, New Orleans. At this time, I recall that Mr. Wolfe told Oswald that if he liked Russia so damn much, why didn't he go there? I do not know why Oswald had said to bring forth this remark from Wolfe. On one occasion, I took Oswald to the Wolfe residence. Oswald and Mr. William Eugene Wolfe, Sr., a naturalized citizen of German origin, argued because Oswald was telling him of the glories of the worker state and saying that the United States government was not telling the truth about Soviet Russia. In another conversation, Oswald stated to me he was not a member of the Communist Party, but he suggested that both of us should join to take advantage of the social functions. I did not join the Communist Party, but I do not know whether he did or not. During the period I knew Oswald, he resided with his mother in the Hotel Senator or a rooming house next door to the Hotel Senator in the 200 block of Dauphine Street, New Orleans. I went with him to his room on one occasion, and he showed me copies of Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. Oswald stated he had received these books from the public library and seemed quite proud to have them. So, okay, let me just point this out. This is one thing I have a problem with Armstrong with. He says things like, he says things pretty definitively like Harvey Oswald was living at Hotel Senator. But then when you read Palmer McBride's statement, he says he resided with his mother in Hotel Senator or a rooming house next door. Now, that's a big deal because the Hotel Senator is an expensive hotel. And if it was a rooming house next door, that probably wouldn't be, right? So it doesn't negate where Oswald was, but it does show that Armstrong is willing to just set aside certain facts. On the evening of November 22nd, 63, I heard a radio commentator state Lee Oswald had been arrested as a suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy. Upon hearing that name, I recalled my association with Lee Oswald in New Orleans. And upon seeing a full-face photograph of Lee Oswald in the November 23rd, 63 issue of the Miami Herald newspaper, I'm now quite certain that they are one and the same individual. I particularly recall the large ears, the mustache, and the receding hairline. Mustache? He must mean like a little scruff, but that's weird because Oswald didn't have scruff, from what we're told. Maybe not back then. Maybe he was only a teenager then. It was later on that he was really, really neat. I also recall Oswald made statements favoring Russia and communism to the employees at the Pfister Dental Lab. I don't recall specific statements, but his central theme always concerned the workers throwing off their chains. I've read and initialed each page, and this is my statement, Palmer McBride. There's 2 paragraphs here. Airman McBride said he made no report of Oswald's statement concerning President Eisenhower to any law enforcement agency. McBride now assumed that at the time he felt the statement made by Oswald was to emphasize his anti-Eisenhower feeling and not made in the nature of an actual threat on his life. McBride stated Mr. Lawrence Williamson, bookkeeper, and Miss Imelda, last name unknown, secretary at Pfister Dental Lab Company, would probably recall remarks made by Oswald favoring Russia and communism. Other company officials or employees named Levesque, Cagle, Bischoff, and Klein would probably recall his remarks. He also stated that he was not acquainted with Oswald's close associations and never attended any type of meeting with him except the meeting of the Astronomy Association. This 4-page document, CE 1386, was well known to the FBI and the Warren Commission. This document and resulting testimony from Palmer McBride and other employees from the dental lab would have shown that Lee Harvey Oswald was working at the Pfister Dental Lab in New Orleans in 57 and 58, while at the same time Lee Harvey Oswald was in Japan on maneuvers in the Philippines and the South China Sea. In 96, I traveled to California and met McBride at his home, Sun Valley. McBride had recently retired from a 30-year career working for NASA. It didn't take long to realize that McBride was very intelligent and possessed a superb memory. He remembered dates, times, places from the 50s and 60s better than I could even remember dates from last year. In 97, I brought Palmer to a Dallas conference on the JFK assassination where he talked about working with Oswald at the Pfister Dental Lab. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play a clip from, what's the woman's name here? Let me see if I can't find this really quickly.
I'm Linda Faircloth. I'm the general manager of Mr. Audra Dental Lab, and I've worked for the company since 1977. And I was asked to make a presentation at the President's meeting about 4 years ago on the laboratory and the original owners, and to explain any infamous characters or colorful characters that had ever been affiliated with the company. And through my search and talking to all of the previous owners, people that had worked for the company, managers, anybody that I could get a lead from, I found out that Pfister was founded in 1906 by Louis Pfister. Audra Dental Lab was founded in 1916 by John Audra. And through this, I called Mr. John Audra to ask him a few questions. And in the conversation, he had told me that one of the stories that I had heard from another person, that Lee Harvey Oswald had worked for the company, and I started asking him questions about it because I immediately labeled him as the person that was going to be my colorful character. And I had heard through Mr. Arthur Stump that Lee Harvey Oswald had worked for Fistra, and he had started as a waxer and didn't do very well at that, so they decided to give him another task. And I didn't know what the task was, but Mr. Arthur clarified that task. He said that back then they decided to get together since Louis Fistra and John Arthur were kind of friends, even though they were competitors, that they went in together and hired this young man to deliver cases across the river for them, and they was going to pay 50 cents a case. And the person that got the job was Lee Harvey Oswald because he had a motorcycle. And for 2 weeks, the cases were taken from the laboratory, and the owners assumed that they were delivered. But then Lee Harvey Oswald just kind of skipped on them. And then they started getting calls from the doctor saying, "Where's the case? Where's my case?" Said, "It was delivered to you a couple of weeks ago." And when they really found out where the cases were, they were on the ferry boat, dumped behind some boxes, and obviously they never did get delivered. So when we put all of this down for the company, we felt we had to get more accurate dates, and these people that I talked to, Mr. Johnny Lopez, Mr. George Bischoff, Arthur Stump, and John Arthur, they all felt that the time of hire was somewhere in 1957 and 1958, and that he had worked for the company somewhere maybe 6 months or so. They're really not clear or sure about the length of time, but everyone was pretty positive that he worked there in 1957. And every time I asked a question, everybody would go back and say, "Well, the one you really need to talk to is Lionel Slater because he worked with him." I talked to Lionel Slater. Lionel Slater said, "The one you really need to talk to is Palmer McBride." And I also talked with Palmer McBride after speaking with John Armstrong. And everybody still goes back and says, well, the time that he worked at Fistra was in the 57-58 era. So, that's the basis of the information that I have on it. And after getting all of this together, I wrote my little report, and I presented it at a president's meeting in Charleston, South Carolina, and got a lot of people getting more interested in the president's assassination through realizing that Lee Harvey Oswald had worked for Fistra on Dolphin Street during that time period. And the lab moved at the present location in 1974, and consequently we lost a lot of records from the move, and then we've had a few floods that we've lost some records, but we've gone back and tried to find out everything that we could and couldn't come up with actual documents, but there's a lot of good people that really, truly believe that the time of his employment was in 1957 and 1958, and that he was a very interesting character.
Did you talk to one or more, or any of the owners of Fistra's about the FBI visiting Fistra's after the assassination? Yes,
I did. I talked to Mr. Johnny Lopez, and he remembered quite vividly what had happened. He said that after the assassination had occurred, that immediately the FBI came in and talked to each one of the owners as well as the department heads. They took all the employment records and advised them not to be discussing the case to anyone. And it was extremely important that they kind of keep this under wraps. And at that point, they took all of the records that the company had in terms of employment records. And this was the very next working day after the assassination. So I'm assuming that would be Monday, right?
Yes, it would be Monday. It would be the first working day. The president was killed on Friday.
All right. So, as you can tell, it's pretty much consensus at Fistra Dental Lab that Lee Harvey Oswald worked there in 57, 58. Just like Just like Palmer McBride said. Just like Palmer McBride said. There were more witnesses. William Wolf will confirm this also, and we'll get to that here in a minute. McBride told the OSI that he met Oswald while working at the dental lab in the fall of 57 and had worked with him until June of 58. When high-level FBI officials realized the Marine records showed Lee Harvey Oswald was in Japan from September 1957 until November 1958, they knew this was a serious problem that could expose the two Oswalds. Quite simply, one Lee Harvey Oswald could not be working in New Orleans in the Marines in Japan at the same time, and certainly not for 8 months. The following business day, Monday, November 25th, 1963, FBI agents were sent to the Pfister Dental Lab and confiscated all employment records, interviewed the owners and 10 employees. They told each and every employee in the dental lab and the owners of the lab not to discuss the case among themselves or with anyone. James Harrison Vance, who knew Harvey Oswald from both the dental lab and the Astronomy Association, was interviewed at length by the FBI. Vance said, "They really shook me up." Employees and owners of the dental lab and members of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association who knew Harvey Oswald in the fall of 57 and winter-spring of 58 were very important witnesses, but their statements and knowledge of Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in 57-58 could never be made public. This is why Palmer McBride was never questioned by the FBI or the Warren Commission. In 1997, Palmer and I were together at the JFK conference in Dallas. Palmer telephoned his old friend James Harrison Vance, who was then living in Mexico. They talked about their adventures in New Orleans and the memories of Oswald. Palmer also renewed his acquaintance with Walter Gehrke, who was living in Denver. Palmer asked Gehrke if he had any records from their NOAA meetings in the 1950s. Gehrke did not have any records, but still remembered the day when McBride brought Oswald to an association meeting at Gehrke's home in early 1958. Presiding over the January 1958 meeting at Gehrke's house was McBride's good friend William Wolf, a student at Corps Jesu High School in the 11th grade. Gehrke recalled that Oswald praised communism and the recent Russian space launches, much to the dismay of the association members. McBride recalled the members were so annoyed with Oswald's pro-communist talk. Wolf finally told Oswald, "If you like Russia so much, why don't you just damn go there?" This was the first and only time Harvey Oswald attended an NOAA meeting, and it occurred at Gehrke's home in early 58, while Lee Oswald was on maneuvers in the South China Sea. I first spoke with William Wolf via telephone in November 1993. I asked Wolf the year that he met Oswald. Wolf thought for a minute and said it was either late 57 or early 58. I then asked him if he remembered telling the Warren Commission he had met Oswald in 55. Wolf replied, "I don't remember telling him that, but it's possible." Wolf never understood why he was called to testify instead of McBride. Wolf said, "McBride worked with Oswald every day for 8 months at the dental lab, but I barely knew Oswald. Why they'd interview me instead of interviewing Palmer." Wolf and McBride discussed the topic on several occasions, and they always wondered why the Warren Commission interviewed him instead of McBride. The Warren Commission and later the HSCA and the ARB never interviewed Palmer McBride, William Wolf, the members of the Astronomy Association, or any of the employees or owners of the Pfister Dental Lab. And today, we know why. In 96, I met William Wolf for lunch in his hometown of Slidell, Louisiana. Wolf worked as a computer systems analyst. Wolf said I was just a kid and was so overwhelmed by the events and testifying before those people that I didn't remember as much. The one thing I do remember is that it seemed to me they were mostly interested in what Oswald had to say about communism and my father kicking him out of the house. I asked Mr. Wolf to pinpoint the date of this first meeting with Oswald by listing his years of attendance in junior high and high school, and then relating those years to his association with the NOAA. Wolf wrote on a napkin the years of his junior high school attendance and his sophomore year at De La Salle High School in 55 and 56. He then recalled that he missed the entire 56 and 57 school year due to an illness. Wolf said, "When I returned to school, I began my junior year at Corps Jesu High School in the fall of 57 and attended meetings of the Astronomy Club. I met Oswald sometime after Christmas 1957, probably in January of 1958. I met him for the first time at Walter Gehrke's house when he was with McBride. This meeting occurred in early January 58 and was the only time that Harvey Oswald visited the NOAA. November 23rd to 25th, 1963, the FBI begins a cover-up. Harvey Oswald's employment at Pfister Dental in New Orleans for 8 months, while Lee Oswald was in Japan, is the key to understanding Harvey Oswald, Lee Oswald, and their involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy and the murder of DPD officer J.D. Tippit. If we understand who was responsible for creating Harvey and Lee, then we will know who was responsible for the assassination of President Kennedy. We are now able to conclude with a reasonable amount of certainty that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover knew about Harvey and Lee Oswald before November 22nd, 1963, and he knew about each of their backgrounds. Hoover was prepared on November 22nd, 1963. Wait a minute. Okay, let me make a comment real quick here. So there's that document, and I just learned this recently. The document regarding the imposter using Oswald's birth certificate in June of 61. Okay, that has nothing to do with an actual person who was using it, who they suspected of using it. When you read through the thorough exchange of those memos, what you'll find is that there was an issue with Oswald's birth certificate that was being held by the government, and for some reason, the government itself, I forget whether it was the FBI, they had let Hoover know that there was a potential vulnerability and that it would be possible for someone to access his birth certificate. It wasn't because somebody had already used it and they had information about someone using it. It was about because it was basically exposed and they feared that somebody might be able to get a hold of it. That is why that memo happened. So just to put that in context, people shouldn't. I even used that in my book, and I'm going to have to correct that in my second edition. So let me continue. The FBI's first priority was to locate and seize records that would show Lee Oswald and Harvey Oswald in different places at the same time. This is the reason they seized records from Tujagues within hours of the assassination from Stripling Junior High the next morning from Pfister Dental Laboratory on Monday. Within the next 3 days, Oswald's Minox spy camera became a light meter. Lee Oswald's driver license and file disappeared from the Texas Department of Public Safety. School records were seized in New York City, New Orleans, Fort Worth. The FBI fabricated W-2 forms to change the dates of Oswald's employment in 55 and 56. Hundreds of items of evidence were fabricated, altered, or manipulated. The FBI then gave photographs of this so-called evidence to the Warren Commission so they could piece together documents and establish a timeline and historical background for one fictitious Lee Harvey Oswald. All the commission had to do was follow the FBI's so-called evidence and conclude that Lee Harvey Oswald shot and killed President Kennedy. Within 72 hours, the FBI had officially solved the case and issued a written report. A few of the unanswered questions are, 1, when did Hoover first learn about Harvey and Lee? And 2, how did Hoover acquire a detailed biography of Harvey and Lee prior to 11/22/63? On November 22nd, 1963, who, if anyone, directed Hoover to seize and destroy all records relating to a second Oswald? On Monday morning, 11/25/63, FBI agents arrived at Pfister Dental Lab. The agents took the owners and employees of the company one by one into a private room, told them they were not to discuss the Oswald matter among themselves or with anyone. The agents then took all the records and files relating to Oswald and left the building. These records would prove that Harvey Oswald was working in New Orleans in 1957 and 58, while at the same time Lee Oswald was in the Marine Corps in Japan. All the files from the Pfister Dental Laboratory disappeared and were never seen again. More FBI cover-up. The FBI was sent Palmer McBride's statement by the U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigation. McBride's statement clearly said that Oswald lived at the Hotel Senator in New Orleans in 57 and 1950. It says 68, but it's 58. When FBI agents were sent to Hotel Senator, they specifically requested records as to Marguerite and Lee Harvey Oswald's presence at this hotel in 1955 and 56. They did not request information for the years 57 and 58, as reported by McBride. No records were found which allowed the FBI to report that Oswald never lived at the Hotel Senator. More FBI cover-up. During the next 3 days, the FBI fabricated a 1956 W-2 form in an attempt to show that one person, Lee Harvey Oswald, worked at Pfister's in the year 56 rather than 57 and 58. The fictitious form was placed among Oswald's possessions at FBI headquarters and returned to Dallas police on November 26, 1963. The FBI photographed this fictitious form and gave a photograph to the Warren Commission. More FBI cover-up. The FBI gave only one document to the Warren Commission to show that Oswald worked at Pfister's. The document was a black and white photograph of a 1956 W-2 form that was fabricated by the FBI. The FBI provided no verifiable documentation whatsoever to show that Oswald worked at Pfister Dental Lab in 56. The Warren Commission, however, with no verifiable documentation and no dates of Oswald's employment at the dental lab, reported that Lee Harvey Oswald quit work at J.R. Michaels and then worked at the Pfister Dental Lab for several months thereafter. The day after assassination, Oswald's personal possessions from his room at 1026 North Beckley and Ruth Payne's home in Irving were confiscated by the Dallas police. Each and every item was dated, initialed, and inventoried by police detectives and then photographed on the floor at the Dallas police headquarters. The following day, these 225 items were secretly sent to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. 3 days later, the FBI returned these 225 items with an additional 230 items to the Dallas police. The fabricated W-2 form for Dolly Shue, Tujagues, J.R. Michaels, and Pfisters were created by the FBI and were among the 230 additional items the FBI returned to the Dallas police. The FBI wants us and the police, us and the public, to believe that these fabricated W-2 forms from the year 56 were given to 16-year-old Oswald, kept in pristine condition for the next 7 years, and found by Dallas police among his possessions in 1963. However, not one of these W-2 forms were initialed or dated by Dallas police detectives. None were listed on the inventory of items confiscated from either 1026 North Beckley or Ruth Payne's home in Irving, and none were photographed by the Dallas police on the evening of November 22nd. The only initials on these W-2s were those of FBI document examiner Robert Frazier. Each and every one of these W-2 forms were fabricated by the FBI for the express purpose of merging the background and employment of Harvey and Lee into one person, Lee Harvey Oswald. None of these W-2 forms were ever verified or matched with state or federal records, never verified or matched with Social Security Administration records, and these original fabricated W-2 forms disappeared. Only black and white photographs remain at the National Archives. Black and white photographs of the W-2 forms were sent to the Dallas police on November 25th and were to be listed by the Dallas police as Oswald's possessions. I sent a copy of these W-2 forms to the archivist at the IBM Corporation. The archivist said that all these W-2 forms were typed with the same typewriter. These W-2 forms are fabrication created by the FBI in an attempt to merge the teenage employment and school history for both Harvey and Lee into one fictitious Lee Harvey Oswald. I love that. The W-2 forms were typed on the same typewriter. Fabricating and destroying government records. Harvey Oswald's employment at Dolly Shue, Tujagues, and J.R. Michaels, Pfisters, and the Marine Corps, Department of the Navy, required that payroll taxes were withheld and sent to the Internal Revenue Service to the Louisiana Department of Revenue. Deductions were made from Oswald's payroll checks and sent to the Social Security Administration, while numerous records were prepared and sent to the IRS and to the Louisiana Department of Revenue. These records could have confirmed Oswald's beginning and ending dates of employment and with each and every company where he worked as a teenager. The FBI, Warren Commission, the HSCA, and the ARRB could have requested these records from federal and state governments, but they didn't. Why not? Because these records would expose the two Lee Harvey Oswalds and two Marguerite Oswalds. For example, tax records would show that while Harvey Oswald was working at the Pfister Dental Lab in New Orleans for 8 months, Lee Oswald was in the Marine Corps in Japan. These records could never be given to the Warren Commission and could never be made public. Within days of President Kennedy's assassination of all of Oswald's original employment records as a teenager were confiscated by the FBI, and nearly all original records disappeared. Only black and white photographs of a few questionable records remain at the National Archives. But what about income tax reports and records sent to the IRS and the Louisiana Department of Revenue? What about payments to the Social Security Administration and their records? Surely these government records would remain intact. After Oswald's death on November 24, 1963, his widow, Marina, applied for survivor benefits from Social Security. According to the Social Security Administration, Marina was entitled to benefits based on her husband's lifetime earnings and calculated as though he had reached full retirement. Marina was entitled to receive benefits based upon her husband's average lifetime earnings. However, unknown to Marina, Oswald's records at the Social Security Administration had been altered. There was no record of Oswald's employment in the 1950s, no record of his employment at Dolly Shue's, Tujagues, Pfisters, J.R. Michaels, or 3 years in the Marine Corps. Why? Why were no records for Oswald's employment for over 5 years in the 1950s? Because these Social Security records would show Lee Oswald's year-long employment at Tujagues in 55 and 56, while Harvey Oswald was attending Warren Easton High School. These records would show Lee Oswald's employment in the Marine Corps in 57, 58, and 59, while at the same time Harvey Oswald was employed for 8 months at the Pfister Dental Lab in New Orleans. Social Security records for Oswald's employment in the 50s had to disappear, and they did. Oswald's first year of employment, according to Social Security records, was 1962, after he returned from the Soviet Union. When Marina applied for Social Security benefits, the only years of employment found in the Social Security records for Oswald were 1962 and 1963. What we are seeing here is the government covering up government records. So when you add up all of his employment earnings, the only companies that you actually have documentation from are William Riley, Jagger Charles Stovall, Leslie Welding, and the Texas School Book Depository, totaling $33,608. A month later, after receiving completed application for survivor insurance benefits filled out by Marina Oswald, the Social Security office in Dallas had completed a determination of award. Below is the first part of that form. And this form here shows 3306. It says elapsed years on years dropped, 61 to 62. I don't know what that means. But it shows that he only earned $3,306. The amount shown under heading total earnings is according to the Social Security Administration. Oswald's total earnings from 51, the base year of starting date, through 63, the last base year or closing date. At the time of his death, Social Security records for Lee Harvey Oswald were safely tucked away in their files from the date of Oswald's first employment in 55 to his last employment in November 63. Monies were withheld from Oswald's earnings, and along with his employer's contribution, were paid into his account at the Social Security Administration by Dolly Shue in 55, Tujagues in 55 and 56, J.R. Michaels in 56, and Pfister Dental Lab in 57, 58. 3 years in the Marines Department of Navy, 57 through 59. However, the only contributions to Social Security that were used to calculate the determination of award for Oswald's widow, Marina, were those made in 62 to 63. Why? How could anyone explain Lee Harvey Oswald's 57-58 income for 8 months at the Pfister Dental Lab in New Orleans, while at the same time Oswald's 57-58 income for 8 months of service in the U.S. Marine Corps? If the Warren Commission, the HSCA, or AARB wanted the names of all of Oswald's employers and fact-based accounting of his earnings, contributions to Social Security, and dates of his employment, they would have requested this from the Social Security Administration. However, if Oswald's original unredacted records ever became public or known to the public, they would show the payments and contributions made by employers of both Lee Oswald and Harvey Oswald to the Social Security Administration. How to explain contributions to Social Security from the Department of Navy in 56 to 59, while at the same time contributions were made by the Pfister Dental Lab in New Orleans for 8 months? What was the reason neither Warren Commission, HSCA, or ARB requested such documents? The lack of information relating to Oswald's teenage employment, including the dates and incomes earned in 55, 56, 57, 58, and 59, came to the attention of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. On May 15, 1978, Robert Blakey, Chief Counsel and Staff Director of the House Committee, requested from the Social Security Administration access to all files and documents concerning or referring Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald. On July 28th, the Social Security Administration responded to Mr. Blakey's request and provided dozens of documents, but not a single document relating to Oswald's Social Security file for his employment in 55 to 59. The Social Security Administration did, however, somehow acquire and provide documents that were not in their files. They provided, see number 23 is a document above, copies of 3 pages of Warren Commission report reemployment of Lee Harvey Oswald prior to service in the Marine Corps. In 55, 56, 57, 58, and 59, monies were withheld from both Lee Harvey Oswald and Harvey Oswald's earnings, and along with employer contributions were sent to Social Security. If original Social Security records were given to the Warren Commission and or the HSCA, it'd be impossible to explain how Harvey Oswald could work for Dolly Shue while at the same time Lee Oswald was attending Beauregard Junior High School in the winter or spring of 55. Original Social Security records would show Lee Oswald worked at Tujagues from June of 55 to August of 56. And at the same time, Harvey Oswald was attending Easton High School, September and October of 56, and working for J.R. Michaels. Robert Blakey and the HSCA did not pursue their request to access all files and documents concerning or referring to Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina. Documents that would show Harvey Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald were in different places at the same time. Blakey and the HSCA also failed to request access to documents on another issue, concerning the whereabouts of both Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald in September 58. Documents that would show Harvey Oswald in Taiwan, while at the same time Lee Oswald was in a hospital in Atsugi, Japan. both in the Warren Commission and HSCA, they knew about Harvey and Lee to avoid any investigation into Oswald's teenage employment and activities. All right. Well, once again, the record seems to contradict what people remember, So, but all the skeptics will say that these people are just wrong, or they're mistaken, or they're lying, or whatever, the usual stuff. But again, I'm here and presenting this. It's pretty clear. It's pretty clear cut that there was something going on here with Lee Harvey Oswald and his employment records. And was there two Oswalds? I seem to be leaning in that direction. I want to be able to say 100%. Currently, I'm at 99%. But that 1% is a big thing. Going through the military records is what's giving me pause, and I need to finish doing that. I'm only about halfway through it. But I'm going to get through all that stuff here pretty soon, and hopefully I'll have a conclusion. Friday, I'll be on Fresh and Fit presenting this stuff. So hopefully everybody will tune in. But that's going to do it for me today, guys. I will be back tomorrow with more. Thank you so much.